Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we begin today, I want to first thank all of you for your presence and support in our memorial yesterday for Jim Hickman. It was a very moving experience for all of us. And dozens of people have emailed and called yesterday afternoon and got more emails in my computer this morning, people being very moved by our tribute to Jim Hickman. And so I just wanted to note that and to appreciate everyone on Humanity Rising. It was a beautiful event. We want today to continue our exploration in a fundamental sense of what is happening in the mind of Donald Trump as he begins his presidency with really three apparent priorities, which I would like to explore as we continue to seek to understand what is motivating Donald Trump and what it is that we all need to take in and consider as his administration begins to unfold. I think there is internal priorities and there are external priorities. And what I would like to do is to begin our reflections today on this seeming paradox between waging peace in Ukraine and waging war in Gaza and the Middle East. And then I'll conclude my reflections by noting the proportional internal drive by the Trump administration to consolidate authoritarian control under this theoretical framework of what they refer to as the unitary presidency. But let us start with the Middle East. I want to begin with referencing this latest little flap that surfaced several days ago from one of the journalists at The Atlantic, journalist called Goldberg, who revealed that the central command, shall we call it, of the U.S. government, the Secretary of Defense, Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, Donald Waltz, the National Security Advisor, J.D. Vance, the Vice President, and about a dozen others in the highest reaches of the Trump administration were discussing the plans for the attack on the Houthis in Yemen and discussing timing, weapons, targets, and somehow or other, Donald Waltz, the National Security Advisor, included Mr. Goldberg from The Atlantic. And that's how the information got out. First of all, that they were conferring on signal, which is in violation of all the norms and protocols for the Pentagon and the State Department and the White House. They have very specific, classified, protected channels of communication. And here they were freely talking on signal I'm on Signal. Many of you are on Signal. It's well known that it's a little bit more encrypted than WhatsApp, but not much. And like WhatsApp, like Telegram, Signal has a open back door to the intelligence agencies of the US government. So nothing on Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp or any of our communications are secure. They're all being monitored by probably not only the US intelligence agencies, but other intelligence agencies as well, which we should all bear in mind when we think we're having a private conversation. Encrypted, as they keep telling us, except to the intelligence agencies. I want to note one particular detail because I think it's informative of what is going on generally in the Trump administration, particularly with regard to the Middle East and with regards to Ukraine. And also, I would say, with regards to the buildup of the unitary presidency internally to the United States. And that is that when they received the news of the US attack, which was focused, as we all know, not on hardened military forts or mountain fortresses by the Houthi, but on open civilian areas, and killed hundreds of women and children who had nothing to do with the conflict. If you saw some of the transcripts, Tulsi Gabbard, Stephen Wynkoff, the special envoy of Donald Trump to the Middle East and to Ukraine, Marco Rubio, thumbs up, victory, big smiles, jubilation that the attack had been successful. We were going to show the Houthis lesson. And I think it was Stephen Wynkoff, if my memory serves me correctly, says, "Onwards to victory." When I saw that, I realized that Donald Trump is not being moral in trying to end the war in Ukraine, as I will explain in a few minutes, nor is he moral in what he is doing in the Middle East. They're all in the grip of what Carl Jung calls mass hysteria. I've referenced this before, but I think it's very important for us to bear in mind as we contemplate the highest reaches of the US government, what's going on in Israel, and perhaps other places around the world. Jung coined the term and presented his understanding of mass hysteria actually at Yale University in 1938. He was invited to give the Terry lectures at Yale because by then he was very famous and had made major breakthroughs in terms of the unconscious, the existence of archetypes, the anima and the animus functions in the psyche. He was the one who developed the notions of introversion and extroversion. And in his Terry lectures, he sought to explain the phenomenon of the Nazis. And he says that mass hysteria is the only thing that he could conjure up in his mind to explain what was going on. And he says the typology of mass hysteria, the characteristic of mass hysteria, is when perfectly ordinary people, rational, moral, conventional, with families, go to church or synagogue, and are otherwise perfectly law-abiding citizens, engage collectively in something that can only be described as insane. And we see mass hysteria all over, and it's a very important psychological formation, this miasm in a collective consciousness that would give ordinary people who probably feel in an individual level deep compassion for women and children being summarily destroyed, but collectively will cheer when this happens, given the fact that they're all working together for a specific end. And it doesn't matter whether it's the final solution to the Jews or the final solution to the Palestinians or the attack on the Houthis. So let us bear in mind that when we are watching the Trump administration unfold, like we watched with the Biden administration, we often project onto these individuals a morality that we hold and we assume as human beings they hold. But we forget about the deeper reality that perfectly moral, law-abiding individuals, when they get into a group and they're given power, they become susceptible to a psychic miasm, a psychic seizure that will take them collectively off the cliff. It's an extraordinary aspect of the human psyche. Now, I want to deepen our understanding of, again, this polarity between waging war in the Middle East, waging peace in Ukraine. Because one would have thought that Donald Trump, given his statement in his inaugural address that he wanted to be a peacemaker, why did he immediately support the Israelis in renewing the genocide after the ceasefire, which he himself demanded for his inauguration? Let's examine that. Because I think what we're witnessing at the largest level of history are the spasms of imperial collapse. And the spasms of imperial collapse have many characteristics, but one in particular is what William Fulbright, who was the senator from Arkansas back in the 1960s, who alone for many years was a critic of the Vietnam War and wrote a book which I read as a young man with great excitement called The Arrogance of Power. And I think that if you look at the decline of imperial systems, one of the most common characteristics is imperial overreach, the arrogance of power, and the engagement in completely senseless wars at vast expense, which end in colossal failure. But it's based on a calculus that seems right at the time. And I want to articulate what the assumption set is for the Trump administration as it does the bidding of Israel. Because we need to remember that in the Middle East, the United States is not acting in an independent, sovereign way. And we're witnessing one of the rarest phenomena that I know of in history, where a great imperial power is being controlled by a very small state on its periphery. I can't think of another example of where a major country has been under the control of another country in such a sustained, insidious way as the control that Israel and the Israel lobby in the United States exerts over the US government. It's quite phenomenal. It's based on three assumptions. Number one, the Arabs are too weak to do anything. The Palestinians, they're too weak to do anything. Really? Number two, Israel and the United States are invincible. While our enemies can do nothing, we can do anything we want. And number three, nobody in the world is going to contest it. That's the perfect recipe for the arrogance of power as the imperium goes through the spasms of collapse. It's a complete misjudgment of history. That was the predicate when the United States, for example, went into Vietnam, went into Afghanistan, went into Iraq, went into Ukraine, which I'll get to in a moment. The enemy's weak. We are invincible. Nobody's going to do anything. So we can do what we want. Even genocide and the mass expulsion of the Palestinians so that Trump can build Club Med. There's no bounds to the arrogance of power if you think that your enemies are too weak to do anything, that you're invincible, and nobody's going to call you into account. I was very struck when I looked at Steve Wyckoff's interview with Tucker Carlson late last week, which I recommend to all of you. He personifies the toxic psychosis and mass hysteria of the Trump administration with regards to the Middle East. No reference to genocide, of course, no reference to the tragedy, no reference to the civilians killed, no reference to anything humane. His only reference was that as a result of what's been happening, the Israelis have succeeded in reducing both Hezbollah and Hamas. to no longer being an existential threat. And I thought to myself, whoa, that's the best you could do after 50,000, mostly women and children, have been blown to bits, that Hamas is no longer an existential threat. But as the Israelis say, but it's not quite over because we have to eliminate them entirely. So, as you all know, they're moving into northern Gaza. There's indications that they're going to take it over and make it a permanent part of Israel. And they're working with the United States to try to find some country in Africa that will accept 2 million Palestinians. And the main objective is Iran. That's the main Israeli objective, is to take on Iran. And we'll see how it all unfolds. But the workings of history are inexorable. And when we ask this question of, does the man make history, or does history make the man, as has often been contemplated by historians and philosophers, who are the actors in history? Are there individuals, or are there inexorable economic, political, cultural, astrological, spiritual forces? And what happens in this relationship between the individual and history is when that rhymes, when we enter into the kairos, as the Greeks would put it, as opposed to the chronos. Chronos is the calendar. Kairos is the fullness of time. That's what empowers an individual to rise to his or her moment in the historical process. It's not just them. It's the confluence between the individuals and the moment. And if you're off by a millimeter, you're never heard of again. If you're right into the moment, you're swept up and you become an actor on the stage for that brief shining moment where you're in alignment with the kairos. It's an extraordinary thing, history, and how it moves. Let's leave the Middle East and now go to Ukraine, because I want to suggest for your contemplation the following: that we have the inversion of the equation that's motivating more war in Ukraine, and which, because this equation is inverted, is compelling peace. War in Gaza and the Middle East is compelling peace in Ukraine. It's worth contemplating. Remember, I said that there are three assumptions. The enemy's weak. We can do whatever we want. Nobody can do anything. It was Thucydides, the ancient Athenian general in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War in the late 4th and early 3rd centuries, that wrote his great history called the Peloponnesian War. And he has a comment in it where he says, because the Athenians were acting basically like the Americans in Eastern Europe and like the Israelis. And he had a great line. He says, the strong do what they want, and the weak suffer as they must. And that's politics. What we see in Ukraine is that the enemy that we thought was weak has defeated us on the battlefield. The Russians have won the war. The invincible Americans and NATO that thought they could just come into Ukraine and do whatever they wanted have been revealed, as Mao Zedong once said about the United States, as paper tigers. All the vaunted missile systems and tanks and anti-aircraft Patriot missile systems and so forth and so on haven't worked. Just a few days ago, the Ukrainians were complaining publicly that these F-15s that were sent to the Ukrainians with great fanfare by the Biden administration don't work. The Russian fighter jets are far more sophisticated. And thirdly, we're not in a situation where the rest of the world is doing nothing, or in a situation which not only has the enemy been victorious, the United States and NATO has been found completely invincible. But Russia has allied itself with China, Iran, India, Brazil, South Africa, and over 100 countries around the world that are entering the BRICS coalition and are about ready to take out the US dollar. That's why Trump is being forced to try to get some peace agreement in Ukraine. He is not an asset of the Kremlin. He is not channeling Vladimir Putin. He's not a moral man. He actually doesn't care about peace, as far as I can see, given his comportment in the Middle East and his support for genocide. He's being compelled by history to do what he has to do because he has no choice. Now, I want to explain this because this is really important for us to understand, everybody. I want to explain this by remembering what happened in the Vietnam War. Because I agree with those that believe that the greatest analogy for what's going on in Ukraine is what happened in Vietnam. And it's worth, therefore, remembering what actually did happen in Vietnam. I was a young man. I turned 18 in 1969 and refused the draft and almost went to jail and was on the streets, and I tracked it quite closely. Remember 1968, it all started. So you had, in 1968, Gene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy running for president as peace candidates. But the deeper significant event was that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in South Vietnam had mounted what was known as the Tet Offensive. This is important because America went into Vietnam with the same three sets of assumptions. The enemy's weak, we are invincible, nobody's going to do anything. Well, all of a sudden, in the spring of 1968, the Viet Cong mounted the Tet Offensive and out of nowhere took over several major South Vietnamese cities and laid siege and defeated the American and the South Vietnamese army in open battle. And it was like an astonishing event. Lyndon Johnson, who was president at the time, seeing that Gene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy were seizing that moment to attack him on the war, announced, as you may remember, in March of 1968, that he wouldn't run for re-election. He knew he was done. That's another example of inevitabilities. He also started to negotiate with the North Vietnamese. People don't often remember that, but it was Lyndon Johnson, after many years of war, that was the first one to start negotiations with the Vietnamese because he knew the US had been beaten. And the political class in Washington in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive knew that the US had been defeated. So once that realization sunk in, it wasn't that Lyndon Johnson was a moral man. He wasn't channeling Ho Chi Minh. He just was recognizing the obvious. And the obvious was that the United States had lost, and that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had won. Now, this is where it gets interesting. How does one negotiate? Do you negotiate with the Viet Cong, South Vietnam? Do you know, do you negotiate with the North Vietnamese in Hanoi in North Vietnam? They did what Trump is doing today. You have to go to where the power is. That's North Vietnam. As you remember, in November of 1968, Kennedy had been killed, assassinated on June 5th, 1968, and Martin Luther King was killed, etc. And it was Richard Nixon that came in to the presidency beginning in January of 1969. He also understood that the United States had been defeated. And he was as hardcore an anti-communist warrior as anybody who ever was in the White House, but he understood the reality that it was over. He sent Kissinger, if you all recall your history, to Paris with the North Vietnamese. And they began to have peace discussions while, like Trump, continuing to give weapons and so forth to the South Vietnamese. The South Vietnamese were terrified, like the Ukrainians are today. What do you mean you're going to talk with Russia? What about us? the great powers continued, and then finally they had an agreement that, well, the South Vietnamese would be part of the U.S. delegation, but not there in their own right. And the Viet Cong would be part of the North Vietnamese delegation, but not there on their own right. And the Thieu regime, he was the general who had seized power in South Vietnamese, did everything that he could to destabilize and obfuscate and delay and so forth and so on, as the United States and North Vietnam began a peace process in Paris. There were arguments about the size of the table and the configuration of the table. Should it be a round table? Should it be a square table where all four parties were on different sides? No, that didn't work. And I actually don't recall what the configuration of the table was in the end, but it was a big debate that lasted for months. And I wanted to bring this to everyone's attention because this is happening again. Zelensky says, we've got to be at the table. The Europeans, Keir Starmer and the Prime Minister of Britain and, Macron in France, we've got to be at the table. And Trump and the Russians says, what do you need to be at the table for? It's got ultimately nothing to do with you. This is about Russia and America. We're going to make the deal, and then we're going to tell you what it is. And you see that this is essentially what's been happening as the Ukrainians, a few days ago were ordered to come to Jeddah, and the Russians were there, and the Russians were talking. Then the Americans would go tell the Ukrainians, we're going to have a ceasefire in the Black Sea. And the Ukrainians are jumping up and down saying, wait a minute, we don't like this, and da 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 da. It's exactly what happened in the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong continued on the battlefield to defeat the United States and the South Vietnamese. Till finally, as we all remember, in the spring of 1975, the whole thing collapsed. And the peace agreement was left behind in the rubble of history, and the Viet Cong marched into Saigon and took over, and then united South Vietnam, which had been separated from North Vietnam by the French colonialists. Vietnam was always a single contiguous country, with some exceptions over the thousands of years, of course. Occasionally they were taken over by China, so forth and so on. But basically, Vietnam had always been contiguous. And then it became contiguous again because of the inevitability of history and the inevitability of the end of colonialism in the aftermath of the Second World War. The British Empire collapsed. The French Empire collapsed. The Dutch Empire collapsed. And in its place came the burgeoning American Empire that made all the same mistakes. All the same mistakes. The one place where the mistake was the most egregious was Ukraine. I've talked about it many times before, but it's worth remembering a few salient points because this is what is now coming to a close. And that is what will be remembered as the era of the neocons, which are examples par excellence of imperial overreach leading to imperial collapse. They have dominated US politics since the early 1990s and since the Bush senior administration until Trump. And it's very important for those of us who are Americans to understand that this is at base what is happening. The genius of Gorbachev was that he saw beyond what mutual assured destruction constrained the Americans not to see. They couldn't see beyond anti-communism, anti-Russianism, and mutual assured destruction. When the Soviet Union came to an end, they realized that they could seize the moment for complete imperial power. And I have said this many times, but I want to bring it into sharp relief with something that you may not remember. But Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter during his presidency and presided over the complete and utter fiasco of the Iran hostages, which made inevitable the collapse of the Carter administration and the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Brzezinski went on to be considered, like Kissinger, one of the great historical commentators and international specialists. He wrote a book published in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard. And in the Grand Chessboard, he made the following assumptions and declarations as someone who knew more about world affairs than just about anybody. I knew Brzezinski, and he was so self-assured. When you talk to him, you just witness him pontificating because he was right and everybody else was wrong. And he said a couple of things. Russia should be broken up in this great grand chessboard global game, as he called it. There was nothing that Russia could do about it. Back to these assumptions. Russia's weak. We can do what we want. Nobody's going to do anything about it. It would be impossible, he said, for Russia to ally itself with China. It would be impossible for Russia to ally itself with Iran. It's not going to happen. And he says, as we move NATO to the east, we don't have to use US troops. We can use the Slavs. We can use the Eastern Europeans to fight our wars. And this is exactly what happened. Ukraine has been a proxy I'm sure there had been a few American soldiers who've died who were there covertly, but basically no Americans have died in Ukraine. It's hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Some people estimate up to 800,000 Ukrainians. Donald Trump doesn't care about Ukraine. Neither did Joe Biden. Ukraine was simply a proxy. It was simply like in Vietnam, a place where the United States, feeling it was invincible, feeling that the enemy was too weak to do anything, decided to take it all. And just like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, just like the Taliban in Afghanistan, nobody expected the genius of Vladimir Putin, who came into power in the year 2000. Russia was a complete mess and rebuilt the Russian state, reanimated the Russian Orthodox Church, pleaded with the Americans to let Russia join NATO and the EU because he said, as Gorbachev said, as Yeltsin said, we're not your enemy anymore. We're not communists anymore. Why can't we just all get together and be normal? But that wasn't enough for the Americans because they were still locked into this mass hysteria of the neocons and full spectrum dominance and the unipolar supremacy of the United States over the world. That we're going to take over all of Eastern Europe. We're going to dismantle Russia. We're going to go into the Black Sea. We're going to go into Ukraine. We're going to go into Georgia. We're going to come up through Central Asia. We're going to break it up. If we break up Russia, we can subordinate China. That's been the plan for the last 30 years of every president since George Bush Sr. until Trump. When the imperial overreach collapsed in the face of somebody that turned out not to be weak, and in the face of the United States that turned out not to be invincible. And the very country that we sought to destroy made alliances with the Asian and Middle Eastern and African and Latin American nations and is now emerging as the world's superpower. That's the reality that Trump is encountering. And that's why Marco Rubio was the first Secretary of State ever to talk about the end of the unipolar world and the emergence of the multipolar world. Because the American political class, not just Donald Trump, like it wasn't just Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon, but the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies have all concluded that Russia, like the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, has won the war. So there's no choice but to withdraw. There's no choice but to withdraw. That realization has not yet dawned on anybody in the Middle East. And the arrogance of power continues the conflict because the assumption set hasn't been upended by somebody like Ho Chi Minh or Vladimir Putin. Just imagine if in the Middle East, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the young Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, rose up and said, "You don't stop the genocide and create a two-state solution, we're going to stop oil." Just think what the impact of that would be. And created a military alliance with Iran and Egypt and demanded an end to the genocide and the creation of two states. It would happen, not because it's the right thing to do, but because the enemy turns out not to be weak, but strong. The Israelis and the Americans, probably the Americans first, would realize that we can't overcome this and that the rest of the world is behind that emerging coalition. Until that happens in the Middle East, the Israelis and the Americans are going to continue to build Club Med in Gaza because it has happened in Ukraine. As I predicted 3 years ago, the Russians were going to win, the Americans were going to walk away, and Ukraine was going to be destroyed. That's what's happened. And that's where we are. Another analogy that you might just consider in understanding what's happening in Ukraine is what the Romans endured during the reign of Caesar Augustus. Well, Jesus of Nazareth was a little boy running around in Palestine, probably watching his father as a carpenter and helping as he could. The Romans were engaging in their imperial overreach, and they decided, started by Julius Caesar, carried forward by Augustus Caesar, that they were going to take all of Europe. They'd taken Gaul. They'd gone up into the Britain. They'd taken what is now Belgium and Holland, parts of Western Germany. And they decided they were going to defeat the Germanic tribes once and for all and absorb all of Europe into the Roman Empire. And in the fall of the year 9 AD, they battled the Germanic tribes in the Teutoburg Forest in Germany and were completely annihilated. It marked the first time that the Romans had been so completely defeated in an act of imperial expansion. And the Roman elite contracted. Sort of like when you poke a snail that's just going along and they contract. That's what the Romans did. That's what the Americans are now doing. It's these spasms of collapse. These are spasms of failure. And they never went into Germany again. That became the border. And it was part of the genius of Augustus that, unlike the Americans after Vietnam, after Afghanistan, they didn't stop. That's the arrogance of power. Had Richard Nixon been like Augustus, had the American political elite really understood the forces of history, it would have stopped this imperial expansionism. And that's what Gorbachev offered, was a world in which we live and let live, we respect each other, and we just get along. And because the Americans have refused to do that, we've ended up where we've ended up in our world today, and now in the withdrawal from Ukraine. I want to make two small points, and then I want to conclude with some internal reflections about the domestic situation in the United States. One is that in Vietnam, like in Afghanistan, the local government went kicking and screaming like the Ukrainians, like the Europeans, with no effect. And you can see this kind of happening with the Ukrainians. You can, if you were watching the meeting between Zelensky and Trump and Vance in the White House, that very famous or infamous moment, you can see Zelensky trying to get a real discussion going, and the Americans being essentially upset that he wanted to have a substantive conversation, rather than obsequiously thanking the president for his limitless generosity and strategic genius. But now the Ukrainians know they have no choice. And they're just kind of going along. But on the other side, when there was this announcement of a ceasefire on the energy infrastructure of both sides, by the end of that day, the Ukrainians had attacked Russian energy infrastructure and continue to do so. The Russians haven't struck back on the energy sector. They've been hitting all kinds of other sectors, but not the energy sector. And so the Ukrainians are in this excruciating situation, realizing that they're going to give up much of their land, and that it's not any longer a question between war and peace, because the Americans have decided they're going to walk away. It's between how much land they have now and how much land they're going to give up and lose before they finally concede that the Russians have been victorious. That's really the only question that's left in Ukraine, which is my second point. Whatever takes place in Europe and whatever takes place in these negotiations, the only question that remains to be resolved is, what are the Russians going to take? In Vietnam, they took all of it. In Afghanistan, they took all of it. In Ukraine, that's not what the Russians want, and that's not what Putin wants. They want the 4 provinces in eastern Ukraine, which are basically linguistically, culturally Russian. Remembering that Ukraine was part of Russia for almost the last 3-4 centuries. And so the Russians drew their red line on at Ukraine because they said the United States can have everything else, but you can't take Ukraine. It needs to be neutral. That's all they were requesting, is that Ukraine be neutral. That was the agreement when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991 and began to form itself anew in 1992, was that Ukraine would be neutral. It was in the Constitution. According to polling at the time, 80% of the Ukrainians supported neutrality. And in the course of the next, from 1991 to 2014, 25 years, everyone was happily neutral until the United States decided that they were going to take Ukraine, and they began to mobilize through the Endowment for Democracy, through USAID, through the Pentagon, the CIA, the destabilization of Ukraine. And then they overthrew Prime Minister Yanukovych in 2014 and went from neutrality to virulent anti-Russianism and began to mobilize attacks against the Russians in eastern Ukraine. That was what precipitated the war. The war did not start in 2022 with the special military operation. The war in Ukraine started in 2014 with the overthrow of the neutrality of Ukraine and the sustained attack by the Ukrainians, supported by the United States and NATO, against the Russians in eastern Ukraine. Why? Because the United States wanted to provoke war, because they thought Russia is weak, we are invincible, nobody's going to do anything about it. They kept blowing the Russians off. And finally, Putin said enough. And the rest, as they say, is history. This is how empires fall. And this is why when we ponder Trump, we ponder Putin, Ho Chi Minh, General Tu in South Vietnam, we have to always be open to this interplay between the individuals who make history and history which makes individuals. Because it's that interplay that ultimately manifests history in the way that it does. No individual can overcome history. And history cannot overcome the individual. It's the conflation, it's the symbiosis, the synergy between an individual and historical processes that elevates someone to power, but also takes the power away. And that leads to the final point of what's going on domestically, which is also, in my view, inevitable. That as empires collapse, so does the civic virtues that built the empire within. The same corruption that motivates imperial overreach is the corruption that dismantles the civic institutions, and in the case of the United States, the democratic institutions that built the republic. And that's what happened to Rome. during the reign of Caesar Augustus, who was called the first Caesar. Trump, no doubt, will go down as the first American Caesar. It's called the unitary presidency. This notion started by the neocons. Because if you want full spectrum dominance, if you want to control everything, democracy becomes an impediment. You want someone in the Oval Office that controls everything. So what's happening under Trump has been underway for the last 30 years. And it was Dick Cheney Secretary of Defense, Chief of Staff under George Bush Sr., Vice President under George Bush Jr., that articulated the unitary presidency. That balances of power don't really make sense in an imperial system. And that the president should be above the law, which the Supreme Court last year agreed with. That judges shouldn't have final say. The president is the commander-in-chief, and his power should be absolute. That's what happened with Caesar Augustus. Although, unlike Trump, he was a genius. And the institutionalization of absolute power was so subtly and masterfully implemented. It was called the Principate, that the Romans didn't even know it was really happening, which is an interesting discourse I'd like to make sometime about the different instrumentalities that are deployed historically as people consolidate power. There's a certain crudeness to Trump. And because he's a crude intelligence, he's consolidating power in a very crude way that is both laughable at one level, completely tragic at another level, as he systematically dismantles the civic institutions that have undergirded the strength of the United States and which actually brought it to world supremacy. All those are being undermined. Why? Because the more you weaken the constitutional system, the more you consolidate that power in the White House, the more you can do whatever you want on the world stage. And that, in my view, from a personal level, motivates Donald Trump more than any other single thing that I can think of. He wants to be king. And that's why, as you're seeing in the news, they're already saying that he's not going to end his term in 2028. They're already beginning the process of extending his term. I think he'll be close to 90 years old if he lives that long. But they have no plans for real elections anymore. And we all just need to take that in. The executive order that he made yesterday, from now on, anybody wanting to vote, you have to prove that you're a citizen. Many Americans, how do I prove I'm a citizen? Does a driver's license count? Does that prove I'm a citizen? There's a lot of foreigners that have driver's license. Do you have a passport? Most Americans don't have passports. It's like what the Republicans did in North and South Dakota to the Native Americans. They passed a law in the legislature saying that in order to vote, you had to prove your address. Well, the Native Americans on the reservations don't have addresses. They live in North Ridge or they live on the other side of the river and they all know where each other are, but they don't have addresses. That's a white man's thing. So because they didn't have addresses, they couldn't vote. So you maintain the appearance of democracy. Yeah, everybody can vote, you know, but you got to prove you're a citizen. You have to do X, Y, and Z. And the point of the exercise is to continue this process of reducing the voter rolls and maximizing the control over social media. So when you see Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Tim Cook, I don't remember who the CEO of Google is, come to the White House and kiss the ring. When you see the Trump administration breaking the back of Columbia University and universities all across the country, breaking the back of major law firms in Washington. What is happening is a control mechanism and strategy that includes social media control. And what you're going to start seeing on social media more and more is the apotheosis of Donald Trump into a demigod that's here for the saving of the world. And so when we look around us today, we have to be very humble in the face of inevitable forces. And we have to be very cautious of these platitudes. Oh, Trump is channeling Putin. He's an asset of the Kremlin. We have to be cautious about what actually can be done domestically to ensure the survivability of democracy. Because the constraints of history, the spasms of collapse, are exacting their toll, limiting options, and making it imperative that we not only be ruthlessly realistic in terms of what's happening, but also ruthlessly realistic about what actually can be done to remedy the situation. As the crises deepen, the opportunities unfold, to be sure, but it is the configuration of the crises that determine the trajectory of the opportunities. We ain't in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. We ain't in Kansas anymore. The world order is shifting out from right under our feet. And how we navigate through the coming days and months and years in this extraordinarily consequential moment of history, where between 2025 and 2030, we're going to experience probably the most consequential years, maybe in all of human history. This is one reason why we're convening the State of the World Forum in December in Washington, because I can't think of a more important thing for any of us to do than simply spend the time to try to understand what on earth is actually happening. So thank you everyone for joining today. I realize these are challenging times. I also realize that sometimes I can be provocative to many of you. I come to these insights not in the spirit of truth possessed, but in the spirit of truth pursued. I'm open to other points of view. I'm just sharing what seems to me to be true at this moment. It might change by next Tuesday. Who knows? That is our world. We're contingent beings. But I think what we've tried to do with Humanity Rising is, at a minimum, to convene the conversations that truly matter so that we can understand where we're headed and therefore what we need to do. And most fundamentally, who we need to be. So thank you. I will join the after chat, those of you who may be interested in deepening this dialogue for a little bit, and then we'll see you all tomorrow again on Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.